Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished audience, I'm delighted to greet everyone at our panel discussion today, even among these extraordinary conditions. My name is Dorka Tokaci, and I'm an analyst at Political Capital. And I'm equally happy to greet our guests today, who are Christian Jójárt, an external fellow from the National University of Public Service Center for Strategic and Defense Studies, and Peter Krekó, who is the director of Political Capital, Europe's Futures Fellow at the IWM and ERSA Foundations. Today, our panel's topic will be NATO's cyber policy strategy, challenges and solutions. My first question would be that is there such a thing as a cyber policy strategy?
I'm not really an expert on NATO, but the way I think NATO's stance on this question is defensive purely, and it's also reactive. I think NATO was very late to recognize. It recognized, if I correctly recall, in the 2016 Warsaw Summit, that the cyber domain is an equal domain as any other battle domains. And subsequently, NATO has to prepare to tackle threats in this domain as well. So I think that was a late recognition. All the other main peer competitors of the West, like the Russians or the Chinese, were, to my best knowledge, a lot quicker to recognize this. And NATO is thus, I think, very much late. And I also believe that it is somewhat illusory to expect from NATO to react in an effective way to any cyber threats, simply because what is NATO criticized for a lot is the slow response, the slow way of decision making, the slow progress to activate the Article 5 in the field of cyber domains, when everything happens in the matter of nanoseconds. I think it is somewhat illusory. And also, what would it mean to joint together? I mean, to respond jointly on behalf of NATO, what would that mean? Like a joint cyber army or a joint cyber offensive? I think the key here is the constituting members of the NATO, like the big powers, obviously, like the United States and its cyber capabilities.
And what is the relation between cybersecurity strategies and the capabilities of the allies and NATO itself? So what is the relation between these country levels and the alliance level?
Again, the way I see, and I'm aware, NATO prescribes for the member states to, first of all, to secure the NATO infrastructure itself, and secondary to do all the necessary steps to secure their own national cyber and information infrastructures. So I think that's the coordination here. But as I told, I'm not really an expert on NATO, so I would not really elaborate more on this because I might be wrong on this subject.
We have seen recently certain malign campaigns deploying masses of trolls and bots, which have a truly deteriorating effect on societies. How could be these harms made smaller?
I do think that the biggest problem with bot and troll attacks that are, according to the researchers of Oxford University, are strongly prevalent in 70 countries these days, or in 2019 it was prevalent in 70 countries. So they call it computational propaganda, and it combines a lot of tools that on the social media domain with multiple functions. The most important function in a lot of cases, and it's especially true with the disinformation and computational propaganda campaigns that are run for foreign policy purposes by actors such as Russia, China, but also Iran, India, Saudi Arabia, and others. So they usually aim to undermine trust in the national authorities and the traditional sources of authority, not only politicians, not only political stakeholders, but as it was well illustrated in a study recently by the European External Action Service, Russian disinformation right now connected to the coronavirus also targets doctors, for example, and medical institutions. So every traditional source of authority should be undermined in line with a strategy that wants to weaken your competitor. But also it can, as a second function, and it's quite typical for state-financed computational propaganda campaigns using trolls, bots, and many social media tools at the same time, including advertisements as well, is to weaken the credibility of your political opponent, being it an NGO, being it your political rival, being it some external actors, via malicious online activity and strong coordinated campaigns. The third function and role of these campaigns could be to somehow divert the discussion and kill the possibility of a democratic debate. If you are going online and participate in a debate, and there are a lot of trolls or bots arriving there, trolls are usually real individuals who are under fake names, or possibly in some cases in their own names, but with an agenda participate in the discussion and try to personally attack you, for example. Bots are the algorithms without any direct human activity that do some similar things. They are more prevalent on Twitter, and we can also talk about cyborgs that are combining the two logic. So what these kind of tools usually can do with democratic discussion, practically to undermine the possibility of a sensible debate via personal attacks, ad hominem attacks, via fueling a very heated emotional debate that kills any rational arguments, and also to divert the discussion to a different topic where the speaker finds itself much less comfortable and more difficult to interact. And also a fourth function could be silencing. So if you're regularly attacked by bots and trolls, then it will definitely take away your mood and undermine your motivation to participate in discussions, and especially if these are state-led actors that are sending you multiple messages, threats, and so on, as it happened in many cases, for example, with journalists who uncovered troll farms and propaganda activity of Russia, of China, and other countries. So this is what is really important to understand is that, and I'm mainly talking here about the disinformation aspect because this is what I'm a bit familiar with. So what is important to understand is that disinformation is not just an opinion. It's not just a narrative. It's not just something that you can listen to, agree or disagree with. Disinformation is something that can really change the course of history. It can change the course of political events, and it can even cost lives, as it happened, for example, in Ukraine.
As you mentioned, certain times these attacks are directly, basically led by state actors. How should we deal with the problem of non-attribution? And I aim this question to both of you.
We as analysts sometimes find it very, very difficult to obviously attribute a malicious online campaign to a specific political actor. I mean, you are seeing, for example, 100 let's say, Facebook sites that are spreading very similar messages, all in line with, for example, the Kremlin soundbites. but at the same time, you don't have any direct proof, like a bullet, smoking gun, like money transfers to owners of these groups. You don't even know who is running them, that are coming from the Kremlin, for example. So I think what we can do in these cases is that if something seems to be highly coordinated, same message coming from multiple sources at the same time, following, let's say, the communication lines and rhythm of state actors, then we rather have a good reason to attribute it to a state actors. But I mean, practically, we should use our common sense. And at the same time, I think we have to avoid going into conspiracy theories ourselves, because if it's really difficult to attribute and you don't find enough, at least circumstantial evidence to do so, then the best thing what you can do is that you are just raising a suspicion, or say that this is a not non-verifiable, let's say, statement that it belongs to some kind of state actors. Usually the thing is that I think this kind of activities are quite easy to spot and identify using common sense. If you are hanging around on the internet, it's much more difficult to attribute, but probably Christian will have some better tools on how to do that.
Well, I'm not a technical expert either, and I agree very much with you, Peter. I think we should determine first what level of attribution we need for, or what attribution is needed for. Do we want to indict the perpetrators at a criminal court? Then certainly we lack the 100% attribution, because it's technically impossible. But do we want to respond to a certain cyber or information attack? In that case, I think attribution is perfectly possible, like not 100%, but let's say 99%. I think it's a good example to note here the US Department of Justice indictment against the 12 GRU Russian military intelligence officers who carried out the hacking of the US Democratic Party, and then they subsequently leaked the information through this site, the DC Leaks. And if you read, I think it's 28 pages long, this indictment, you can have a good insight how much attribution is possible. The name and ranks of the intelligence officers are named there. The exact GRU units are named in this indictment. And of course, the indictment doesn't elaborate the sources they gathered this information from, but you could see that it's technically possible. Maybe it's not only from technical intelligence, but other sorts of intelligence. I think it's 90% attribution is purely possible here. And maybe that would be satisfactory if we just want to respond and not to bring the perpetrators to a criminal court.
Christian, what do you think? How does cyber warfare fit into Russian military grand strategy? Is it a new phenomenon, or does it build on pre-existing traditions?
Well, I think, of course, militarization of the cyber and information domains are a relatively new phenomenon, obviously. But the underlying principle of why the Russians are doing this is not new at all. Indeed, it's as old as warfare itself, I think, and it's called indirect strategy or indirect approach in the warfare. In a nutshell, the indirect strategy means that you're not looking to physically destroy the enemy troops, but rather to break the enemy's will to fight, its capability and will to resist, and break the support of the war effort. And this is as old as warfare itself, and it has a great tradition in the Russian military thought, not so much in the practice until Ukraine, which was obviously built on such an application of the indirect methods. But in the Russian military thought, it has a great tradition to think like this. and how it fits to the Russian strategy, the Russian military strategy. I think, first of all, we must understand that the Russian military thinking is substantially different than any other Western military thought. And the reason it is so much distinct, I think, is the holistic approach. The Russians have a lot more systemic and a lot more comprehensive view on what war is and how to fight wars. And the good example, I think, to illustrate this is that if we look at the Russian strategic military exercises, because during these exercises, the Russians not only trained the military, but they also train other ministries as well, and not just the typical power ministries like the Ministry of Interior, which has its own paramilitary forces, but also very, very different ministries like the Ministry of Transportation or the Ministry of Energy. So they train all these ministries and government agencies to cooperate, to work together in the common war effort. Another good underlining example to this holistic approach, I think, is the case of the National Defense Control Center. This is a high-tech information fusion center that coordinates all the work of the ministries and government agencies that are involved in the security of the Russian Federation, and it works in peacetime as well. And if we look at the information and the cyber domains, what we find is that under certain notions, the Russians mean very different things than the West. For example, if we look at what information warfare means in the West and in Russia, information warfare in the Western military thinking is mostly related to disruption or defending against the disruption of the command and control centers. It contains psychological operations as well, but on a tactical and operational level and during wartime. In the Russian perspective, information warfare mostly means the cognitive psychological aspect, and on a strategic scale, not only on the tactical and operational scale, and in peacetime as well, which fits to Gerasimov's notion that the line between war and peace is blurred. So the Russians see that we are already at war, or we are either in the preparatory phase of a war, and you should manipulate the public opinion of the enemy country. So this is holistic approach, I think, which explains to a lot of extent how it fits to Russian strategy. But on the other hand, it is also very important to note that this holistic approach not only determines how Russia would fight its wars, but it also determines how the Russian political and military elite perceive the world around themselves, and particularly, I think, on the threat perception of the Russians. And that explains, I think, the thoughts of Valery Gerasimov, chief of the Russian General Staff, who had this infamous speech from 2013, and since 2013 onward, he held a speech basically every year with the similar or same content, in which he said that basically he depicted a perceived Western grand strategy that aims to topple regimes which are not friendly, which do not sympathize with Western countries, with the United States, and the strategy of what they call the color revolution. It aims to topple these standing political regimes through peaceful, non-military means. And of course, the information warfare is a crucial enabler of this, because the Russians perceive that information warfare allows for the mobilization of the public, the population, against its own government. And if it does not achieve the desired result, which is regime change, then the Russians believe the United States and its allies tried to stir up the chaos even more, so that it could serve as a pretext for open military intervention, usually in the form of humanitarian intervention. And I think until recently, it has been underestimated, the Russian threat perception, very much. And everybody thought that what Gerasimov told in this speech in 2013 was basically the sort of introduction of a new doctrine. But I think first and foremost, it was a genuine assessment of the Russian general staff regarding the current operational environment, the current forms of war. And subsequently, one could argue that the Russian information and cyber operations to a large degree mean to prove their capabilities, to serve as a deterrence against what they perceive as a Western threat. Just think on the Bolotnaya protest, which was also interpreted by, in 2011, 2012, it was interpreted by the Russian political and military elite as a US regime change attempt. So this is one aspect. I think the holistic approach and the holistic and how holism determines Russia's own threat perception. The other layer of this to explain how it fits to the Russian military thought is the forecast, the prediction element of the Russian strategy. The Russian military thinkers are very keen on forecasting the future forms of war, the future operational environment, and again, the holistic approach. They don't just look at the weapons development, for example, which obviously determine how wars are waged in the future, but they look beyond and they also assess wider technological progress and development and how it will impact warfare. But they also look at the social, political, and economic dimension as well. So when they look at the information side of the story, what they conclude is that the current information technology enables to influence public opinion on a scale and quality which was never seen before. And on the other hand, when they look at the social political developments, they realize that the voice of the public opinion matters more now in the political decision making, including in the matters of war and peace. So if you combine these trends, there's a reasonable conclusion on behalf of Russia that you have to manipulate the public opinion of the Western countries, because you can then force them to change the policy of their own government regarding war and peace. So you have to convince the public opinion, and the current information technology allows you to do this on a relatively low cost. So I think overall, this is how it fits to the Russian strategic thought.
I'm really happy that you, Christian, mentioned the Gerasimov it's not really a doctrine, but it's statements and opinions and all the many manifestations of his thoughts. And I think that what you emphasized is very important about the perceived threat from the West. And this is the very interesting thing, because we usually discuss the active measures and the information warfare of Russia as something as a highly proactive and highly new thing. On the other hand, Gerasimov's argument, in line with a lot of other military leaders and political leaders in Russia, is that the West is doing it already, so we should do it as well in order to defend ourselves. And yeah, this constant references to the so-called color revolutions, and all the events in the Arab Spring, for example, were depicted as a color revolution. Why we shouldn't forget, for example, that the US embassy in Tripoli and its staff suffered very brutally from their difficulty to foresight what is going to happen. So I would rather say it's a conspiracy theory that the West was behind all this, but they really believe in that. And these kind of conspiracy theories, via this increasing threat perception, are just providing a perfect justification for introducing this new hybrid warfare efforts. But this kind of mimicking is still, I think, a very important feature of Russian public policy, and soft power tools, and on the other hand, the hybrid warfare efforts as well. It's a distorted copy paste of what they think that the West is doing.
So, well, regarding this, is the West really doing it already? Because in fact, you also mentioned primarily defensive capabilities, that this is what NATO and this is what the West is developing. So what do you think? What would be the key to respond to below the threshold attacks? Would it be mutual deterrence, maybe?
Yeah, I think that's practically the only way to go here. Many experts compare the current standoff in the field of cyber domain to the nuclear age of the 1950s, when there were no established rules of behavior yet. There was no established nuclear deterrence yet, but after, by the 1970s at least, they managed to live together with this, and there was the mutual deterrence. And I think this is the only way to go in the cyber domain as well, because the cyber domain and the information domain clearly favors offense over defense. You cannot guarantee, as of technology stands now, 100% defense against cyber threats. So I think the only solution here is that to boost up our own offensive capabilities. And what is going on at the moment, I think, is strategic signaling of intentions and capabilities. So if we look at what the Russians are doing, for instance, they hacked the US elections, right? But they didn't interfere in any critical infrastructure, right? They didn't attack nuclear power plants like they did in the case of Ukraine, for instance, because obviously Ukraine had no tools to fight back. But on the other hand, the Russians demonstrated on Ukraine that they are capable to do the same against the US. And on the other hand, the US also has, of course, very impressive cyber capabilities, which it does not really advertise as much as the Russians do. But we also saw the case, the Stuxnet virus, which neutralized the uranium centrifuges in Iran. That was a joint US-Israeli cyber operation. And of course, the Russians watched it very attentively. And on the other hand, against Russia, I think there is a very, how to say it, very polite messaging toward the Russians, I think, on behalf of the Americans. Last year, I think last spring, there was this New York Times article which said that the Pentagon is allowed to carry out probes against the Russian energy infrastructure, electricity grids, even without presidential approval. And the New York Times article was based on a leak from the administration, but maybe this leak was intentional because obviously the Russians got the message here that regardless of who the president is in the White House, the Pentagon would do very offensive cyber attacks against Russia if the Russians did the same against the US. So I think at the moment, what is going on is the strategic signaling of the capabilities and the intention to do that.
I think your question is really relevant, Dorka, on does the West already doing that? What Russian military leaders often assume they do. I think the perception is much more than the reality in this sense. And generally, we can say that I think in let's say exploiting the possibilities in using the social media for foreign policy and even sometimes military tools, Russia and China, for example, are way beyond the West, which is and the West is much more I think reactive while they are proactive, which of course probably morally is the right thing. So of course, I mean, if you do not want a full-scale war, and if you claim that you are not using the totally same methods as they do, I mean, for example, a troll army or an army of bots is not necessarily something. It's the deception of the public opinion. So the function of trolls and bots is that they create a false perception of mass support behind sometimes very marginal opinions. So if you do that, then you mislead the audience. And I think these are real valid moral questions, how far the West can go. And you cannot necessarily fight fire with fire all the time. So I think to a certain extent, this kind of reactive approach is morally justifiable. On the other hand, yeah, I think we could see it in many cases, and the US presidential election was the most shocking experience from that respect, that the officially most prepared and developed countries can even meet these kind of challenges totally unprepared. And I think that's why it's important to analyze, to track, and to bring to the public the instances of authoritarian exploitation of the cyber domain, because they need responses. And I think the West is right now probably better, at least in defensive capacities, than it was 3-4 years ago. So some kind of awareness raising, some kind of alarmism, I think can be useful for preparing this kind of threat.
Yes, I would like to add that I was talking about particularly the cyber capabilities and the cyber domain, and not the information. Obviously, the West is not doing what the Russians are doing in the in the information space, and you're right. And the West should not do that, of course. What the West is doing is the strategic communication, but that's something very different than what the Russians mean under the same concept. The strategic communication, in their view, is like manipulating and distorting the truth.
Regarding strategic communication, we can see quite different patterns of treating and handling the coronavirus crisis amongst democratic forces and amongst authoritarian ones. What do you think? Are they exploiting it? Are they really that different at all?
I'm not sure that we can talk about democratic versus authoritarian patterns in handling the coronavirus in general, because we can see huge differences case by case, even in the democratic world and even in the authoritarian world. On the other hand, I think there is a pattern that we can observe in some authoritarian states about first ignoring the virus or even downplaying its significance, its importance, putting the blame on the West and the democratic world for spreading that, for spreading disinformation about that, as it happened in Iran, for example, where they totally ignored it at the very beginning, and it was a, how to say, really lethal ignorance, as we can see these days, and they even attributed it to the United States, that they are spreading disinformation for panic to decrease the turnout on the elections that recently happened in Iran. So if you ignore it, then it can really come back and destroy you even more brutally. And then I think we can even see a pattern in some states, for example, Russia, to exploit the coronavirus for reducing the still existing voices that are critical towards the government or the administration, claiming that if you are criticizing the authorities in these times, you are just causing panic, and they usually use the criminal code or modifications of a criminal code in highly, how to say, creative ways to remove information that is critical towards the authorities, or to totally silence the opponents. At the same time, we can even see, I think, a tendency in the democratic world, and this is very important. It's not really connected strictly to the topic of this conference, so I just in a few sentences. So if we take a look at the public opinion polls in the Western world, even in countries that they were hit hardest by the crisis, coronavirus, including Italy, for example, we can see a strong rallying around the flag. So it seems like in times, as Anne Applebaum put it brilliantly in his recent piece in The Atlantic, in times of when politics is around life and death, then usually the citizens put higher trust in the authorities and the government because they hope that their activity will help them to survive. And it might be something quite ancient reflex, but we can see it practically all over in the Western world, even in countries that can be rather rightly criticized for their lack of preparedness and their lack of efficient policy responses to the crisis in the earliest phases.
Yes, I agree as far as the patterns are concerned, and it reminded me very much of how the Chernobyl case was handled by the Soviet Union, right? Like the Soviets tried to keep it under the rug. That's what the Chinese did. They remained silent for a very long time, but then when it came to that they couldn't ignore it anymore, their response was very effective. And it's the same as in the case of the Chernobyl. When the Soviets finally intervened, it was very effective. Like they evacuated the 50,000 Pripyat in the matter of hours. That was a very effective response. As far as the exploitation of the virus for propaganda purposes is concerned, the Russians are certainly doing this, and they are sending now the military aid for Italy. They sent, I think, 6 cargo planes now on board with medical doctors and equipment. So they try their best. Obviously, it's not something unexpected. I think that they are trying to exploit it. There were a lot of analyses and articles in the Russian think tank area, field of think tanks about the forecasting of the end of the liberal world order, which they do basically all the time when something happens in the West. They predict the end of the globalized world. So, and of course, they try to boost up their reputation as far as the autocratic countries are concerned, that how effective they are and how much they are more effective than European Union countries. And of course, one such element was the lack of solidarity among the EU countries, which the Russians now try to exploit in their propaganda. That there is nothing to talk about here. There is no such thing as a European Union. Everybody acted on the national level. Everybody closed its borders. But at the same time, if you look at the Russians, they also close their borders with Belarus, despite they are having in the state union, the Государственный Союз. So they criticize the European Union for what they did themselves as well.
I think it's very important what Christian just said, and it applies to China as well. I mean, China right now, and even the diplomats, foreign policy leaders and speakers of the Chinese regime are talking about that the United States is the real source of the virus. And they brought it to Wuhan, which is a totally unfounded, totally ridiculous conspiracy theory that only aims to put the blame on the Western world. And they are pushing it internationally, but pushing it very effectively domestically as well. And the very bizarre thing is that finally, this virus that has been originated from China, as Christian already referred to, the spread of the virus is absolutely not independent of the incompetence and the secrecy of the Chinese Communist Party not to talk about these things, silencing the doctors who were the whistleblowers of this case, and so on and so on. And right now, their message is that we are over it. We were much more efficient than the Western world. And right now, we are helping the Western world to overcome that. So the bizarre outcome can be that China emerges even stronger from this conflict than he originally was, why the origin of the virus is China. And it's not, the most important thing is not about that, where it really originated, but how it could spread, in which the Chinese authorities definitely have their responsibility.
And regarding the cited EEAS report on primarily Russian disinformation in Europe regarding the crisis of coronavirus, what do you think? What should be the proper response to it? Who should respond, and in fact, what?
Well, I think honest strategic communication, I think that could help. And what they are criticized for, and I would say rightly, by the Russians, is the lack of solidarity. I think the European Union countries should show a lot more solidarity. And why would not any country offer, for example, medical help for Italy? Why should we waited for the Russians to do these steps? And of course, the Italians were not in the position to refuse this help. And I think that was something perfectly expected to come, that the Russians tried to exploit this, and yet we were unprepared again, like so many times we were.
Yeah, I would totally agree. Unfortunately, there are good reasons to be critical about what is happening in the European Union these days about handling this crisis, where, yeah, I think most of the decisions simply are done by the member states, why the European institutions became more irrelevant in this situation. And yes, this is an easy target, I think, for malign disinformation right now, that wants to undermine the credibility in the European Union, plus wants to undermine the credibility of the Western institutions. I think one very important thing to do is to push through two messages. And I totally agree with Christian, it's strategic communication. So simply reacting to the disinformation, fact-checking and so on, it will be totally unsuccessful. So there is a need for self-confident narratives. And yeah, it's really difficult to be self-confident in these times, no question. But one very important fact is that if we take a look at the reported cases of COVID-19 and take a look at the press freedom in the same countries, there is a strong correlation between press freedom and the reported cases of the coronavirus. And it's not because the journalists are spreading the coronavirus, but this is because in countries where there are more free public space, usually there are more tests that are done. There's a more systemic effort in reporting the cases of coronavirus. So it's easy to jump to the conclusion that the West is simply more vulnerable. First of all, let's see Russia in a few weeks, and I really hope that the cases of coronavirus infections will remain in Russia in the currently low level. At the same time, I'm quite skeptical about that, because they are just at the very beginning of the phase. So it will spread even further. So you can't see at the beginning what is going to be in the end. Second, I mean, authoritarian countries seem to be much more successful in handling this crisis. But let's take a look at Iran, where the reported cases might be at least, I mean, just 10 times less than they really are. Plus, take a look at the fact that they constantly underreport these cases. Plus, there is a higher level of secrecy around the whole coronavirus. So I don't think that that we should easily accept this conclusion that this is the time of dictatorships and they are the only one who can treat it better. We have to see later. At the same time, of course, I think that this is really a big challenge for democracies these days, and no question that the current virus will transform political systems in the Western world as well. We still don't know if for better or for worse. I think both scenario is still open.
That was a beautiful conclusion to this lovely discussion. Thank you very much for being here, being at this disposal, and to our lovely audience, thank you very much for being here with us.